Hi, in this chapter we will learn how to use SQL commands with PL/SQL. Maybe the thing that makes PL/SQL so powerful is you can use SQL commands just like PL/SQL codes together. You won't need to create another worksheet for it. You can write an SQL code, then a PL/SQL code, then SQL again, and can go on like that. You can have SQL and PL/SQL commands as much as you wish in one PL/SQL block, no problem. Besides, SQL and PL/SQL seem so much to each other, so you won't feel so differences between each other. If you are familiar with one, then you are familiar with the other one too. Why to use SQL and PL/SQL? We all know that if we are dealing with Oracle database, that means we deal with the data. We already know SQL and why to use that. But SQL alone is not enough since you cannot do programming with SQL. You can only get and modify the data. You cannot make some extended logic. You cannot export the data into a file or read from it. You cannot have store procedures to keep some logic, whatever. You need to cooperate with a programming language if you are using SQL. If you look from the PL/SQL side, you generally need some data from the database to do some business. For example, if you are calculating the salaries of your company, you need to get the data of the employee from the database. So you use SQL. Actually, you use SQL and PL/SQL together. You get the data from database with SQL, then operate with PL/SQL, then store it with SQL. In salaries, taxes, bills, automated messages, PL/SQL jobs, sending data with web services, etc. You will need to use SQL and PL/SQL together in almost any project of your company. So after this section, we will be able to create more real-like examples. Now, you can retrieve any data from the database and use them with many different operations in PL/SQL. Besides, you can do DML operations or transaction control statements with PL/SQL codes together. However, there are some issues that you need to know about using SQL and PL/SQL commands. You cannot use DDL commands directly. In a PL/SQL code, you can have SQL queries to get some data, or DML commands to insert, update, or delete some data from the database. But you cannot directly do any DDL or DCL operations with PL/SQL. DDL means, for example, creating a table or altering it, etc. DCL operations are transaction control statements like granting, revoking, etc. These are the subjects you should already know from your SQL lessons. So you cannot do DDL or DCL commands directly. But you can do that with using dynamic SQL that you will see in our further lessons. I needed to tell you that because if you try to run a DDL or DCL commands, you will have an error. Just don't do that for now. As you know from your SQL lessons, a transaction starts when you run a DML command and ends with a commit, rollback, or any system failure. A transaction occurs in SQL engine, but your PL/SQL codes run in PL/SQL engine. There can be many DML commands and many commits, rollbacks in a PL/SQL code. So there can be multiple transactions in one PL/SQL command. Besides, if a block ends, that does not mean that your transaction is ended. This is important. A transaction ends with a commit, rollback, or a system failure. Otherwise, it can live with many blocks. Now, let's see how we get some data from database with a selected query. We use select statement to get data from database, but there is one difference. In PL/SQL, our aim is to store some data into some variables and use them. Then maybe store them back into the database with the new values. So in here, we have a pretty new syntax, into clause. With into clause, you store the returned data into our variables or records. We have our select keyword, then our columns or expressions. We can have one column or expression or multiple, or we can have functions, all valid. What you can use in an SQL command is valid in PL/SQL. Then our into keyword. This is mandatory. We have to write an into keyword if we write a select query, because our goal is to store some data into our variables. But if you know cursors already, don't mix that up with SQL and cursors. They are totally different. After our into keyword, we write our variables or records. We haven't seen records yet, so just think about the variables for now. These variables can be PL/SQL variables or host variables, all valid. We need to have the same number of variables that we have in our select statement. Besides, the types of our variables must match with the same order of the select statement. If the second one in select statement is a date type, our second variable in into clause must be a date type too. If the number or data type does not match, you will have a compilation error. The rest is the same in SQL. Our from keyword, table, or if we join with some other table, tables. Then our where clause and condition if we wish. This is optional. However, there is a pretty important issue. Your code must return only and only one row. If your query returns more than one row, you will get a runtime error, and this is not good. Runtime errors are very bad things that you will face. So be careful about that kind of errors. You can handle that kind of errors when you learn exceptions. So for now, just know that be careful about returning more than one row. Now, let's make some examples. Declare we name varchar2, let's say 50, and v salary, it's employees dot salary person type. As I mentioned before, use person type attribute as much as you can. I used varchar2 to show that any of them is valid. So let's continue. Begin and select, let's say, last name and salary from employees, where our employee ID is equal to 100, and our end. Now let's run and see what happens. As we can see, our query did not run successfully. We see that a standard select query cannot be run in a PL/SQL code. So we need to use into clause in here. Now in here I write into and v name and v salary. Let's run again. As we can see, our code works successfully, but there is nothing to show. So let's print our values. The salary of, let's say, rename is salary. Great. Let's run it again. The salary of King is 24,000. Now let's add first name into our select clause, but not into the into clause. Let's run it again. As we can see, we had an error, not enough values. If we have 3 columns or expressions in our select statement, we need to have exactly 3 variables in the into clause. Now let's concatenate first name and last name columns with a space and send them into our vname variable. Pretty good. The salary of Stephen King is 24,000. Now let's change the places of V name and V salary and try to run again. We have an error. PLSQL numeric or value error. Character to number conversion error. That means we tried to assign a text into a number variable. So what we learn in here is the order of the data types in selects and into clauses are important. They must match with each other. Now let's correct it back and continue. Now, let's change our employee ID to 120 and run again. As we can see, the salary of Matthew Weiss is 8,000. We can change our employee ID to any number and get the results. But what if we change our where clause? For example, let's change job ID is equal to IT proc. Let's run it. As we can see, we have an error. Exact fetch returns more than requested number of rows. That means our query returns more than one row, but this is not valid. If we use select into clause, our query has to return only and only one row. Now let's turn back to our slide. Naming conventions and ambiguities. We need to be careful on naming our variables when we use our variables in where clauses. Our variable names should be different than our column names. Besides, do not try to use a function name, etc. Try to write different names. If not, you may have different errors. Let's check them in examples. Now let's change the name of our V salary to salary like the column name in employees table. And let's run it. But before that, let's change our employee ID is equal to 130, for example. As we can see, no problem. If we use it inside of our into clause, we know that the right side of into is variable area. No confuse. But what if we change all salary keywords with sysdate, for example? Let's run it. We have forgotten to change this salary with sysdate. Let's run it again. This time, our code confused. Sysdate is an Oracle function. We named our variable with that function's name. The problem is not with the sysdate here. The problem is if a variable has the same name with a function, variable takes the precedence over the function. So actually in here, both salary names in select and into clause are our variables. Sysdate function is never called. We can see that with changing the sysdate with another name, let's say vsysdate, for example. From this code, we can understand that we can use our variable names in the select clause too. Actually, the previous example is the same as that. vsysdate is a variable, so that sysdate is a variable too, because we said that sysdate is a salary person type. So what we understand from here is if a function and a variable has the same name, when we call that name in anywhere, that means we called our variable, not the function. Just be careful about that. Our variable takes the precedence over the functions and table names. But in VerClause, the column names take the precedence over the variable name. Let's now make an example and see that. Now let's add a new variable, employee ID, which is employees that employee ID person type. By the way, let's change it with hire date, because we called this with sysdate. No problem, not an important thing. Now let's change our VerClause, where employee ID is equal to employee ID. Let's run it. As we see, we had an error. ExecFetch returns more than requested number of rows. So why did we have this error? Since we used the employee ID column in two sides of the equal sign in VerClause, it seemed like where 1 is equal to 1. If both sides is equal to each other, it returns all the rows in the table. In here, since columns has a precedence over variables, both sides of the equal sign are the columns of our table. Variable is never called. What if we write here, let's say 130 again, and run it? No change. Because of that, our query returned all the rows of the table. If we have more than one row return, we have more than one row error like we did in here. So let's now change our variable name to vEmployeeID and our vSysdate with salary to have some output. Let's change with vSalary. And employee ID with vEmployee ID. We had an error, so let's delete here because we need to have our column name in here. Let's clear up and run again. Now we need to change this with salary person type to avoid inconsistent data types. Let's run again. So far so good. We can use our variables with the select clause or where clause of our SQL code. Just try to choose different names than a column name, function name, or a table name while creating your variables. Alright, now we can use SQL queries with our PL/SQL code, and we can create better examples now, because the main idea of PL/SQL is operating with some data. So this is the end of the lesson. See you in the next lessons.